We continue now at the top of Daf Kuf Gimel Amid Beis in Meseches Bava Metzia. This is Bava Metzia Daf 103b. On the previous Amud, the Mishnah said that just like the sharecropper and the owner, they divide the wine of a vineyard, they also divide bizmuros of econim, they also divide the branches and the poles. Rashi says bizmuros haketzutzin min hagefanim. Again, it means the branches that are cut from the vines. And bekonim, with the poles, mefarish begemara. The Gemara will explain this. Konim hamamidim es hagefanim. We're talking about the poles that are holding up the vines. So again, they divide those as well. And then the Mishnah concludes, Ushneim misafkin es hakonim, they both provide the poles. Rashi says, Ushneim misafkin es hakonim, hachadoshim b'chol shana, meaning the new poles that are put up every year, those are provided by both of them. She'ein ala oris ela lavod v'lishmor, because the responsibility of the oris, or the sharecropper, is just to work the field and to watch over the field. Avol shar devarim, but everything else, al sheneim, that's split between the two of them. That's essentially what the Mishnah is saying. And Rashi notes, V'seva demas nisin, this end of the Mishnah, lesa ela b'kavlonis. That's talking specifically about sharecropper. Again, by a sharecropper, he's going in for a certain percentage, whether it be a third or a half, etc. Because if you're talking about a tenant farmer, again, the tenant farmer essentially is working the field, and he's giving a specific amount of core per year to the owner, and then everything else he's going to take. And it doesn't matter whether it produces a lot or a little, he has to supply the exact same amount to the owner. So over there, lo shaycha chaluka, there you don't have a concept of division, because they aren't dividing in that situation. Over there, the tenant farmer is just responsible to provide a certain amount to the owner, and then everything else essentially belongs to him. And the Gemara says, Tana was taught in a brayso, makam shenohagu liktzor eino rashoy lakor, lakor eino rashoy liktzor. If it's a place where the custom is to cut the produce, he's not allowed to uproot the produce. If it's a place where the custom is to uproot the produce, then he's not allowed to cut the produce. Ushneya ma'akvin zal, then each one can prevent the other one from deviating from the local custom. And the Gemara explains, liktzor eino rashoy lakor, if the custom is to cut the produce, he's not allowed to uproot it. Why? Because hayamar bo'ino de tetavin li'aroy, the owner of the land says, I'd rather that you cut the produce, because that way what is left in the field is going to fertilize my property. V'hayamar lo matzina, and also the farmer, he also can say it's much more labor intensive to uproot the produce, and so therefore he would rather cut the produce like the local custom. And the other way as well, lak or eino rashoy liksor, if the custom is to uproot the produce, he's not allowed to cut the produce. Hayamar bo'ino de tinaker aroy, because the owner can say, I want my land to be totally cleared in accordance with the local custom. V'hayamar, and this one says, the farmer says, bo'ina tivna. He says that I would rather uproot the produce because I actually want to keep the stubble, and therefore he's going to say it's better that I uproot it rather than leave it in the land. Ushnei ma'akvin zal zel lamali, and the Gemara says, well, why does the Brisa have to conclude and say each one can prevent the other? The Gemara says to that, matam ko amar, what the Brisa is doing is it's giving the reason. Matam liktzor eino rashoy lakor, why is it that if the custom is to cut the produce, he's not allowed to uproot it, and lakor eino rashoy liksor, if the custom is to uproot it, he's not allowed to cut it, misham deshnei makvin zal zeh, because each one can prevent the other from deviating from the local custom. And the Gemara continues at the two dots. The Mishnah said, lachrosh achrov, if the local custom is to plow after harvesting, yachrosh, so then he should do that. And the Gemara says, pshit, it's obvious, of course he has to follow the local custom. And the Gemara says, lo no tzrich, it's necessary, ba'asra de lo menachshi, it's a place where they generally don't weed, v'yazaliyu v'nachish, and the farmer went ahead and he did weed. So ma'u detema, what might you have said, amar le, that the farmer can say to the owner, hay denechishna adaita de lo karivna, the reason why I weeded was on the understanding that I wouldn't have to plow, I did this extra piece of work, so I wouldn't have to do that other piece of work, kamash malon, so that's what the Mishnah is teaching, the boy le lefrushele, he should have explained that, he should have said that's why I'm doing it, then it would have been under the terms of their arrangement, but if he doesn't say that explicitly, he is obligated to follow the local custom and plow after harvesting. And the Gemara continues at the two dots. The Mishnah said, Hakol keminag hamedina, everything follows the local custom. The Gemara says, Hakol le'suyei mai, what is the word Hakol coming to include? We always follow the local custom. The Gemara says, le'suyei hadetan rabbanan, it's to include that which we learned in the following Brisa. The Brisa says, Mokom shenagu lahasker ilonos al gabe karka. Let's say you have a place where the custom is to rent out the trees together with the land. The idea over here is that the land requires work. The farmer needs to do work in order to cultivate the produce. However, However, the trees, they just produce fruit and no real work is needed. So the point of the Bryce is that if the local custom is that automatically the sharecropper gets a portion of the trees, so then maskirin, so then that's exactly what they're going to follow. They follow the local custom, and he's going to get a portion of the fruit from the trees as well. Again, even though he's not really doing any work when it comes to the trees. But makom she'eina noagu lahaskir, but let's say it's a place where the custom is not to rent out the trees together with the land, so ein maskirin, so they don't rent out the trees together with the land in that place. And the Gemara says, Makam Shanagu Lahaskir Maskirin. Well, if that's what the Mishnah is coming to include, again, that's what we're saying. The Hakol in the Mishnah is coming to include what we're learning in this Brisa, that a place where the minhag is to rent out the trees, we do it. But Pshita, that seems so obvious. Of course you do that. You're going to follow the local custom. And the Gemara says, Lo no tzrich, it's necessary. There is a chiddush over here. To Kuli Alma Yahavi Betilsa, because everybody else, meaning all the other landowners, they give their land to the sharecropper and they take 1/3 of the crops, meaning the owners take 1/3. V'yaz Aliyu, and this owner comes along and he says, V'yave Beriva, he gives it to the sharecropper and he only takes 1/4 of the crops. He takes less than the local custom. So Mao Detema, what might you have said? The Amar Lay, that the owner can say to the farmer, Hi de Batzri Loch, the reason why I took less for you, the reason why I'm taking less than the normal owner takes, Adaita de Loya Hivna Loch Bilanos, it's on the understanding that I'm not going to give you the fruit from the trees. Kamash Malon, so that's what we're teaching over here. The Boile Lefrushele, that again he has to explain that, he has to state that explicitly. If he doesn't state that explicitly, we follow the local custom and the farmer is still able to take a portion of the fruits from the trees. And the Gemara continues at the two dots. The Brisa above just said, Makam Shanagu Shalo Lahaskir, Ein Maskir, and if it's a place where they generally don't rent out the trees to the farmer, then you have to follow the local custom, you don't rent them out. And the Gemara again says, Pshita, isn't that obvious? Of course you follow the local custom. And the Gemara says, Lo no tzrich, it's necessary. The Chiddush is as follows, to Kuli Alma Mekabli Beriva, because again, everybody else, it's going to be the reverse of the above case. Everybody else in this local area, the owners take 1/4 of the produce. V'yaz Aliyu v'kibla betilsa, but this farmer went along, and he's working the field, and he's going to give 1/3 of the produce to the owner. Mao Detema, what might you have said? Amar Le, the farmer can say to the owner, Hai de tafoy loch, the reason why I'm giving you more than is given to the average owner, Adaita, do you have to leave bilanos? The understanding is that you're going to give me a portion of the fruit from the trees. Kamash Malan, again, it's teaching us the boy le, lefrushele, that he should have stated that explicitly. You can't just assume that you're going to get a portion of the fruits from the trees if that is not the local custom and it wasn't stated explicitly under the terms of the agreement. And the Gemara continues at the two dots. The Mishnah said, Kashem shecholkin betvua, just like they divide the produce, kach cholkin betevenu v'kash, so too they divide the stubble and the straw. And the Gemara says, Amar Rav Yosef says, Bebavel nihigu, in Bavel the custom is, Delo yahivi tivna larisa, that they don't give the stubble to the sharecropper. The Gemara says, Lamai nafkamina, what difference does that make? The ika inish the yoev, that if there is a person in Bavel who gives it to the sharecropper, ayin yofa, who is simply a generous person, velo gamrinan minei, and we do not learn from him. And the Gemara continues, Amar Rav Yosef says, Buchra v'tafsa v'yarkavasa, the first, second, and third of the boundaries, we'll see Rashi in a moment, u'kanei dechizra, and also the poles that hold up the thorns, the balabayis, that's the responsibility of the balabayis, the chizra gufe, but the thorns itself, the arisa, that's the responsibility of the sharecropper. And Rashi explains, Buchra v'tifsa v'yarkavasa, u'kanei dechizra, the balabayis, again, the first, second, and third, and also the poles of the thorns, that's the responsibility of the owner. Sevivos hasada, meaning around the field, at the boundaries of the field, osin choretz, they would make a ditch. Venosin ha'afar ala metzia, then they would pile up dirt along the boundary. Lahagbiya sevivos, essentially it acted as an elevated area, as like a fence. Oleachar zman, after some time, kashenidosh, when it was trampled, so chozer, he'd have to go ahead and do it again. Umosif olav afar shenis, he'd have to add a second time dirt. V'chein shlishis, and do that a third time. That's the idea of the first, second, and third. And then there's also kanei de chizra. There's also the poles that hold up the thorns. It means to say konim shanoatzim ba'aretz. They would stick poles in the earth, larog bokotzim, and then they would weave in their thorns, onesarim, or boards, sevivos hasad, again enacted like a fence around the field. So all of these are responsibilities de bal habayis, the responsibilities of the owner. All of yitzia zos lasos, this amount of spending, that's upon the bal habayis. He has to take care of that. However, chizra gufe, however, when it comes to the thorns itself, meaning hakotzim, sha'orgin bo, meaning the thorns that are actually woven in, saviv hakonim, around the actual poles, darisa, that's the responsibility of the sharecropper. And the Gemara explains, klala demilsa, here's the general rule. Kol ikur bolma de bal habayis, netirusa yeserta darisa. What it means to say is, when we're talking about the main protection, that the bal habayis has to do, but anything that would be considered to be extra protection, that is the responsibility of the sharecropper. Rashi says, Ikr bolma, Ikr shmira, meaning the main watching, she efshar below he, that it's impossible without that, you need to do that, it's a minimum, that's upon the balabayas. And Rashi continues, Netirusa yaserta darisa, the extra protection that the sharecropper has to do, the idea is, Olav lahotzi, he's the one that has to spend. Why? She'enu osa ela lahakal me'olav, the reason why he's adding these extra security measures is to make it easier for himself. Shelo yitztarach letroach klal b'shmirasa, that way he himself won't have to deal with watching over the field, he has these extra measures, but that's why they are his responsibility. And the Gemara continues, V'yamar Rav Yosef, and Rav Yosef says, Mora, the hoe, Zavila, and the shovel, V'davla, and the bucket, V'zarnoka, and the irrigation device, the balabayas, that has to be provided by the owner. But Arisa, the sharecropper, Ovid Be'yore, he's the one that digs the irrigation channels. And the Gemara continues at the two dots. The Mishnah said, Kashem shecholken biyayin, just like they divide the wine, kach cholken bezemuros uvekanim, so too they divide the branches and the poles. The Gemara says, Kanim ayavidataya, what were the poles used for? Amri devei Rabbi Yanai, they said in the yeshiva of Rabbi Yanai, Kanim hamuchlokin, we're talking about these smooth poles, shebahen ma'amidin es hagefanim, they use those to hold up the vines. Rashi explains, muchlokin shenitla klipasin, it means to say the outer layer of the poles is taken off, machso chalav and sha'alein, and again they use those poles to stand up the vines, those are divided. And the Gemara continues at the two dots. The Mishnah said, Ushneim mesafkin es hakonim, they both supply the poles. The Gemara says, Lamali, why does this need to be stated? As Rashi will say, it's obvious. And the Gemara explains, Matam ka'amar, the Mishnah is giving the reason. Matam shneim cholken bekanim, what's the reason they both divide the poles? Misham d'shneim mesafken es hakonim, because they both provide, they both supply the poles. Rashi explains, Shneim mesafken lamali pshita, it's obvious that they both provide. Kevan detana de l'shneim hein v'cholken bohen, since it already says they divide them, memela shamin, and so we know, obviously we know, d'shneim mesafken es hachadashim, they're obviously both supplying the new poles. Di lo yoiv meikara, my polig b'yishanim, because if they didn't give them originally, why are they then dividing them when they become old? So again, the Gemara just said that the Mishnah is giving the reason. Since they're supplying it, that's why they divide them when they become old. And the Gemara continues with the Mishnah, Hamakabel sada mechaveru, let's say a person receives, again like a sharecropper in a field from his friend, V'hi beis hashalchin o beis ha'ilan, Rashi explains, beis hashalchin karka yevesha, beis hashalchin means it's dry land, to lo daya b'mei hagasham, it means to say that rainwater is not sufficient, umimayon sheba mashka osan, so they have irrigation coming, you have some kind of a spring that they're going to use as irrigation for this field, that's a beis hashalchin, essentially it means an irrigated field. O beis ha'ilan, or let's say you're talking about a beis ha'ilan, an area of trees, Rashi says o beis ha'ilan, o b'shvil ha'ilan hahu chaviva ala aris, because of that tree, so it's beloved to the sharecropper, shenotel chelik bepeiros below torach. The point is, the sharecropper agreed to these terms because he wanted to be able to get some of the fruits, and that doesn't take any effort. So you have a situation, again, where he is a sharecropper in this field, and either it's an irrigated field or it's a place where there's trees. So then yovesh hamayon, let's say the source of the irrigation dries up, v'niksas ha'ilan, or let's say the tree is cut down, so the whole reason why he undertook this particular job, now that reason has went away, eino menacha lo min chakora, so he's not able to deduct from, let's say it was a tenant farmer, he was supposed to provide a certain amount, he can't say I'm going to provide less now because it's a less attractive proposition, he can't do that. Rashi says, min chakora, kibla mimenu bechakiros, kach v'kach korin l'shana, meaning, let's say it was a case of a tenant farmer where he said I'm going to provide a certain amount of kor per year, d'meikara lo gali daite, d'mishamayan o ilon, because he didn't make it clear originally that the reason why he had these terms was because he was considering the mayon, the spring, or because he was considering the tree. He never said that, and so therefore the terms remain the same. But the Mishnah continues, Imamar lo, if the tenant farmer says to the owner, Chakurli soda beis hashalchin zu, he says that I want to be a tenant farmer on this irrigated field, he mentions that it's irrigated. O soda beis ha'ilan zeh, he says on this field which has the trees, so then already yavesh hamayon, if the spring dries up, v'niksas ha'ilan, if the tree is cut down, then menachelo min chakoro, he is allowed to deduct from the amount he agreed to originally because he made it clear from the outset that he was agreeing to this because either of the spring or because of the tree. And the Gemara says, Hey Chidami, what exactly is the case in the Mishnah where he's not able to deduct from the amount he originally agreed to provide? Ilema de Yovish Nara Rav. If the case over here is that the large river, this large river essentially supplies the water for all of the local fields, if that dried up, so Amayinu Menachilo Min Chakora, why isn't the cultivator, the farmer, able to deduct? Namely, Makas Medina, he should be able to say to the owner, this is a regional issue, everybody's having the same issue, so I don't owe you the same amount. And the Gemara says, Amar Rav Papa says, the Yovish Nara Razuta, what happened actually is that the smaller channels, they're the ones that dried up, but you still have the main source, the Amar Le, because then the owner is able to say to the cultivator, and Rashi explains, Neimale Makas Medina, again, if the major river dried up, he should be able to say it's a Makas Medina. Utanan Lekaman Bepirkan, we learned later in the Perek, Hamakabel Sadam Echaver Vachal Chagav, Oshanishtafa, in Makas Medina, Menachem and Achakir. So it says later on in the Mishnah that if there is a Makas Medina, if there's some kind of regional Makkah, so then we do say he's allowed to deduct from the Chakiras. And so the Gemara then said the case is that the Nara Zuta, the smaller channel, dried up. Amas Hamayim Shemshicho Min Hanor Hagodol Eitzel Habikal Hashkos Mimena, meaning to say there was an irrigation channel that brought it from the river to this particular field. If that dried up, so then he can't say Makas Medina, and we will continue with this discussion in the next video on Daf Kuf Dalid Amud Aleph.